Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Oh my God, it's so nice to see you again.
Yes, so good to finally meet you.
Congrats on all the beautiful life things. So
Thank
exciting.
you. You as well. You have a baby now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Life is wild. Life is so wild. She's napping with my husband right behind this wall.
Oh,
So if you hear any crying, which hopefully you won't, sorry in advance.
totally fine. Sarah Ghazal Ali is the author of *THEOPHANIES, forthcoming with Alice James Books in January 2024. A
Yeah.
Janikin Scholar and winner of the Sewanee Review Poetry Prize, her poems appear in American Poetry Review, the Kenyon Review, Poem a Day, Guernica, and elsewhere. A former Stadler Fellow, she holds an MFA in poetry from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she was a Juniper and MFA Fellow. Sarah is the poetry editor for West Branch and lives in the Bay Area, California. It's so good to see you here today, Sarah. Please
Me
tell me about
too.
your grad school experience and how you came to write Theophanies.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. This is so exciting. So grad school, I went to UMass Amherst and got my MFA in poetry from 2018 to 2021. And COVID was a big part of that, of course. So half of grad school I did in Massachusetts in person pretty normally. And then the latter half was I moved back to California, got married in the middle of it, and life just was all over the place. So the second half of grad school was done remotely over Zoom, like a lot of things. So I think that my grad school experience was kind of strange because of that. But grad school was it was really interesting. I think that what I loved the most about my master's was being in Western Massachusetts, being in Amherst, because it's just such a literary area. It's really beautiful. It's in the Berkshire Mountains. And you just drive by Emily Dickinson's house on your way to campus just all the time, which is such a strange and wonderful thing. So the environment was really, really conducive to my thinking. So I think being somewhere completely different than where I had spent years, growing up, did me a lot of good. So just, kind of transplanting somewhere else was really beneficial. And I also think that in college, I was pretty narrow-minded about what I thought poetry was or what kinds of things I should read and what kinds of things I should write about. And going to grad school just pushed me out of my comfort zone, I would say. When you're 19, you think oh, I only write one type of poem about one type of thing, and that's it. I'm never going to do anything else. But for example, my first semester of grad school, I took a poetry workshop about animals in poetry, and it wasn't my first choice. You have to rank the classes that you want to take when you're signing up. It was my last choice because as a 22-year-old, I was like, I don't write about animals. I just don't do that. But what is that like now? That just seems so strange and laughable. Why wouldn't animals pop up in things? But I felt so strongly set in who I was. So grad school was really great at pushing me and just forcing me to just broaden my horizons, even if I didn't want to. And, in the end, there are a lot of animals in this book. So thank you to that first workshop. But grad school was also, it was really tough as a woman of color, just being in a very white place. Amherst is really white. And I think even though my program itself was getting pretty diverse while I was there, and in the years just before I got there, the workshop space is still so fraught and it's still I feel like no one prepares you unless you've taken workshops before for just how brutal they can be and just how, I suppose, careless some people can be in their reading of your work and in the way that they give feedback. So I definitely had to learn to thicken my skin a bit and figure out pretty quickly what kinds of feedback I found beneficial and what kinds of feedback was of no interest to me or wasn't really useful to me in any way. And I think that's something that I wouldn't have been able to develop on my own were it not for grad school. I think being exposed to so many different kinds of people and all of their writing across genres was really useful. And then being receptive to their feedback, but not receptive in the sense that I would take anything anyone told me and apply those changes, but receptive in the sense of learning what to weed out and what to respond to and what to absorb was really valuable. That was a long answer.
Totally fine. So Massachusetts seems like a really great place for that sort of thing. I actually did the Juniper program
Oh,
with,
nice.
yeah, like the summer thing in 2020. So it ended up getting like moved online. So I had a completely
Mhm.
different experience probably, but I always like envied those people who got to go in person because it sounds like a great place to go.
It's
But obviously like that's very different from completing an MFA from there.
yeah, yeah, totally.
So Tightwires is all about maintaining a writing practice outside of academia and like beyond the binds of the institution. How have you managed to maintain a writing practice outside of grad school after your graduation?
It's been hard. It's definitely been really hard just because it feels like grad school was almost a pause of sorts where it was like this fully selfish, so to speak, time that was just me focused on my writing. And then as soon as you're out of grad school, there's all these pressures to find a job, figure out your life, get the book published, do this, do that. Like the world and its voices start seeping back in. I think COVID really complicated things because I was interested in doing a post MFA fellowship, like many people are, but I didn't want to do one online. I felt like what I needed was to be physically in space with other writers. Like I needed a more physical community to benefit from one. So I basically took like a gap year and didn't apply to anything. I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic and the way that it kind of made us all restructure how we gather was that there were so many online workshops being offered and online community spaces opening up, and more people were using Twitter and trying to form community that way. And I think that that shift to the virtual realm really helped me kind of maintain that momentum that I had in grad school of writing a poem a week. Because in those like first 2 years of the pandemic, I think people were really trying like so hard to make things accessible, and they made it really easy to find like, your favorite poet is teaching a workshop for like 4 weeks. You can join. And I think doing a bunch of those workshops really helped. It helped me make friends that I'm still really close to today. And like to help me find people who I trust with my work outside of grad school, and then also connected me with some of my favorite writers who are now, like people and friends and not just like these idols. I think those workshops really helped me maintain my momentum. And I also think once a year had gone by, because I graduated in 2021, and in 2022, I think a lot of fellowships resumed being in person. So that year I applied and luckily got the Stadler Fellowship out at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. And so I just finished that up in May of this year and moved back to California. And that was also really, really useful. It was a paid year to just kind of live in this quaint little town in Pennsylvania and be a literary editor for their journal, West Branch, and then also focus on my writing again. So I've just been kind of trying to force myself into spaces that make me write or that give me time to write. And that's been really useful. But that part of my life is now over. And now I have a baby. So I have to figure out once again what's going to sustain my writing practice. Life just keeps looking different every year. But I think for me so far, finding trusted people and just weaseling into random online workshops has been what's been working.
You've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but can you tell me how Theophanies came to be?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, that was part of your first question, and I just skated over it. So the book, I think it's funny because the very first poem that I wrote that I initially thought belonged in this book is no longer in it. But it was the impetus for the book. So in college, I took a creative writing workshop, I think maybe my sophomore or junior year. I'm not 100% sure what year. But my professor, the poet Ronaldo V. Wilson, gave us all the prompt to write a poem or a short story investigating how did he phrase it? Like the origin of our names. And I wrote this poem that went through like 15 different drafts over the years because I really wanted to keep it in the book. But I wrote this poem that was the first time I thought about my name, Sarah. I'd always kind of written and been curious about my middle name, Ghazal, which just feels kind of obvious because it's a poetic form. Like naturally, I'm interested in writing. Like, of course, I'd want to know what that means. So I've always had a pretty clear relationship to that, but I'd never really thought about Sarah and where that came from. So that prompt was the first time that I thought about not me, Sarah, but the Sarah that I'm named after. And that just kind of was the catalyst for everything that followed when I went to grad school. I actually originally felt that I wanted to write this project book about a version of heaven or Jannah that doesn't have any men in it, like this utopic kind of space that's just entirely feminine. But I think I'd really like it was too narrow and too set and nothing could happen there. Like how many poems can I write about that? It just didn't really take me anywhere and it wasn't interesting. And so I abandoned that pretty quickly as just like a personal thing that I guess I was interested in as a concept, but it wasn't really useful as a conceit for a book. And then I just kept returning, even if I didn't want to the figure of Sarah, as in the wife of Abraham. And then when I thought about Sarah, that took me to Hajar, like her counterpart, who in the Bible she's jealous of, but in the Quran it's a completely different relationship. And then I began thinking about all of the matriarchs that we have across faiths, across the Abrahamic faiths, especially. And so I thought about Eve, who has no mother, but is considered, like the mother of humanity. And then I thought about Mary and Mary Magdalene as a figure too, who doesn't appear in Islam, but appears elsewhere. And I just kind of started braiding all these different narratives together of these different women because I don't have living grandmothers in my own family, and I've always really felt that loss. And so I think part of this obsession with these women, with these matriarchs, comes from the absence of matriarchs in my own family. And so I'm kind of turning towards women who I can know something about, who I can speculate about, and just, yeah, I just kind of followed that feminine thread as far as it would take me. And um, yeah, I think that's kind of how it came about. It started off as something completely different and then just obsessively returned to matriarchs and the concept of matrilineage.
That is so fascinating. I did notice that throughout the book, mothers are very like they're held in a position of reverence, whereas the role of fathers seems to always be a bit contentious. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about that duality.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I think I'm Pakistani and Pakistani culture is very, I mean, it's not too dissimilar from many other cultures, but there is this really patriarchal sort of sensibility ingrained into it. And a lot of what I've seen and experienced. And I've just always been very curious about that because it's not unique to my culture. It's prevalent everywhere. It's prevalent in American culture too. And even the way that I have been taught my own faith, like all the prophets are men. And it's not something that I doubt or am necessarily concerned by, but it's just something that I'm curious about. Like across faiths, across cultures, there's been so much emphasis on men and on patriarchal forms of knowledge. And I just wondered, where are the women in that? And how much do the women prop up? And I feel like the natural place that you see that kind of play out is with mothers and fathers. And so that just felt like a really organic starting point where if you're going to think about Eve as like the mother of humanity, then, and Adam is the father of humanity. What about the more specific mothers and fathers that we have that lead to our creation? Um, it's very much not an autobiographical book. I think it's a lot more speculative, and it's exploring like archetypes and like what is the ideal woman and who is the ideal mother, and what do we ask of mothers and women. I think that's like the question that I'm really interested in. And so the figure of a father in a patriarchal culture looks so different than the figure of the mother. And yeah, as like a creative experiment, I suppose it was just really interesting to repeatedly return to those figures and see and like put them against each other, and then also at times like take the father out of the picture altogether. Like what's there? What's the story without like a man breathing down your neck? You know what I mean? Like what does a woman say if a man isn't standing there like also observing and watching and surveilling? And so I think a lot of the poems are they kind of emerge out of that, where it's like what does like the poem Annunciation, for example, it's in the voice of Sarah, but she begins the poem expecting that like you think from the title it's going to be about Mary or Mariam, and it's like I feel like I want readers to ask like who is she talking to in this narrative that she's kind of giving, like who is she having this argument with. And I very much want like Abraham as the archetypal father there to just not be thought of at all. And I hope that that comes across where like it's very much about one kind of mother and not at all about any sort of father. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
So you're a mother yourself now. And we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but I thought it might be interesting to hear your thoughts on motherhood now that and like how it relates to your writing and how it impacts your writing, rather.
Yeah, yeah, totally. My daughter is going to be 6 months old tomorrow, which is so crazy that like halfway into a year. I don't know how that even happened. I feel like people always say that having a kid like completely consumes you, but I think I didn't really believe that. I really thought I would still have a sense of self, but it's so hard. I have not written a thing since she was born. And even just being pregnant, like those 9 to 10 months of like carrying a child in your body. I had a pretty tough pregnancy and was nauseous every single day. I couldn't even think about writing, and I also could not read. It was so hard to read without getting a headache. I would like, it was like motion sickness, but I wasn't moving just all the time. And yeah, I feel like I miss being able to really selfishly and completely be absorbed in a book or be absorbed in a poem that I'm working on without like anyone else needing my attention, but that's just not how life works anymore. So my writing practice has definitely been impacted. It feels now like maybe the only thing that could work for me is to keep applying to residencies so that I can, physically leave for a couple days, maybe a week or so at a time, and fully devote myself to writing there. But with a baby, like in the house with me crying, or like even trying to work while she's taking a nap, it's extremely difficult. And I'm really lucky to have like my mom 10 minutes away for help. And even then, it's all consuming. Like my brain just can't be in writing mode. Yeah, it's really hard. And for me, I feel like I need to read a lot before the words come at all. Like I can't just sit down and open up a Google Doc and start. I very much need to read like 7 different things and then have something kind of be like shaken loose in my brain, and then I can start writing. So it's such an involved process to begin with that if I don't have like a long stretch of time, I can't really get anything done. But I also very much think that, you know, there's seasons in life. And so this is like I have that anxiety that maybe I'm just never going to write again or never really like fully complete a good poem again. Like I'm writing bad drafts, but it doesn't really feel like anything real yet. But I'm trying to tell myself over and over again that there's just seasons in life, and this is one season, and it won't last forever. And as she gets older, my attention will be able to go back to other things. And then that's what residencies are for, and that's what having a support system is for. So yeah, try not to freak out. But yeah, my writing practice has definitely changed. I'm like stealing time to read basically when she goes to bed at night. That's like the only time I have to read and think about words.
I still have a lot of questions about the book, but since you bring up your writing process, let's maybe skip to those questions next. Can you tell me more about your writing process and how you go about writing poems in general?
Yeah, totally. So pre-baby, which is when like 98% of this book was written, I'd say I have a really repetitive and obsessive writing process where I have a lot of difficulty with just like writing a first draft and letting it breathe and moving on from it. I physically cannot do that. I very much edit as I go, like in a poem, which is maybe a dangerous thing to do because I don't have a lot of, sometimes you write a poem and then you save a new draft and that's draft two, and then you save another one. I don't do that. I just like write over everything. Um, I don't know. It's just, I have to. I think I'm just like a little too obsessive and intense with my writing process. So what it'll look like is I'll read something. For example, Etel Adnan was so influential to me when I was in grad school. That was the first time I read her, and I went through everything that she's written, poetry-wise. I have one of her novels, but I haven't read it yet. But I read all this Etel Adnan, and then I was like sitting at my desk with like nine of her books just spread out all over the place and like bookmarks everywhere. And for me, it's like I come across a certain phrase or a word that I wasn't familiar with before, or a turn of phrase, like something like that, that I find curious or interesting or weird. And I write that down on a Google Doc or on a page, wherever, and kind of just follow that image into that curiosity. It's almost like me trying to figure out like what I was initially interested in. I very much don't sit down knowing what it is that I'm going to write, or even with like a goal or a narrative in mind. It's just me following some weird curiosity that I picked up in another book. And then it's almost like the poem that emerges is revealing that curiosity more clearly to me. It's like me tricking myself into actually saying what I think, which sounds so strange, but I think is like the truest thing I could say. But then that ends up being like this 8 or 9 hour obsessive endeavor where I'm just sitting at my desk surrounded by books. Like I'm not even getting up to go to the bathroom or drink water or stretch or anything. I'm just like sitting in front of my laptop, obsessively like a mad person, just going line by line and trying to perfect it as I go. It's just, yeah, it's not a good process. I don't think it's healthy, but it's the only thing that's worked for me. So I generally don't revise my poems too much because I do it while I'm writing them. Because I feel like I can't move on from a line until that line is perfect. And so I just have to spend as long as humanly possible correcting it, or I guess not correcting it, but finding it, and then that'll lead me further into whatever the thought is. So yeah, I don't revise too much beyond that until I feel like I've assembled a book. And so that was when I started like properly returning to the poems and revising. So it's not that I don't revise at all, but that I have to wait until I'm trying to create a wholly new object, which would be the book, to figure out how they all fit together and then revise accordingly, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a really weird, like sitting in the dark, frantically typing away sort of process.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You probably don't remember this, but years ago, you slid into my DMs asking about a poem of yours. You had like a question about it, and it's in this book, and it's word for word
Oh,
the
was it
message that you sent me.
the couplet poem? Was it that one?
Yes, I think
Oh my
so.
gosh.
Yeah. And
That
it's
was
I was
forever
so
ago.
I was so amazed to see that it's still like word for word the same message that you sent me. And so I was just like really interested in hearing about your like development process and how you ended up putting this book together because it was just really interesting to me that you didn't change it at all in all that time.
Hmm. Yeah, that was a poem. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember the title. It was Failed Ghazal for Lokya Kenge, right? That one.
Yes, yes, that one.
Two-liner. Yeah, that was one that I was feeling kind of like unsure about. So I took to
Yeah,
the internet and I was like, oh my God, let me see if someone can
look
help
for
me.
it.
Yeah, the failed ghazal. Putting the book together felt almost mathematical in a way. So I'm very much the person who like printed out versions of all the poems like on her wall. In my old apartment, it was behind my dining table. So like me and my husband would be eating and just the backdrop of poems. It like filled the whole wall. So initially I printed them all out when I was working on my thesis for grad school, because this book is a heavily revised version of my original MFA thesis. And yeah, so the first step for me in putting this together was when I felt like, I'd kind of said all that I had to say about whatever this might be. I printed everything out, I taped it up on the wall, gave it a couple days, just kind of let it breathe, looked at things, looked at how the words looked on the page, like took a step back, took a step forward, just regarded the poems as objects. And then when I felt like, okay, cool, it's time to figure out an order. First, I just kind of, once they were printed out, tried to arrange them like a puzzle, on the wall and just move things around, however, just kind of felt intuitively right. And then I took them all off the wall and, like stacked them all up and just read through it in that possible order. And then from there, what I did was I got a whole bunch of sticky notes in different colors. And I read one more time and I pulled out wherever I saw like the same word repeating or a certain image or motif or whatever. Anything that I saw recurring in the book, I pulled it out and wrote it down. So, for example, like eyes, mothers, fathers, sex, women, Sarah, whatever, like however you want to do it. Birds, there's like lots of birds, so birds could be a category, what have you. And once I had all those words, I gave everything a color. And then I also wrote down like concepts. So like faith is coming up in a lot of poems, belief, disbelief, feminism, what have you. And so then once I had all those things written down, I gave everything a color, and then I went through and put those like color-coded stickies on the poems that had those images or themes. So some poems it would only be one. It's like, okay, cool, there's a mirror in this poem, but there's nothing else. Some poems had like all of them. There's like 8 sticky notes on it because it just covers everything. And then I put them back up on the wall and looked at it like that. And I found that really useful because it kind of just visually mapped out which poems were doing what. And from there, that really helped me with ordering and with structure because I feel like it's a really obsessive, repetitive book where I'm revisiting the same women and the same issues and struggles around faith and being a woman over and over again. And I didn't want that to get overwhelming for the reader, and I didn't want it to be so repetitive that the reader just kind of gets numb and is over it or feels like, okay, cool, we just talked about this. I don't want to keep reading it. So seeing where certain concepts or images were really heavy or maybe too close together visually, I was able to figure out a way to braid the poems together without overwhelming the reader, if that makes sense. Where like I wouldn't want 5 poems in a row that all have a green sticky and all talk about Sarah. Like that would just, you'd be inundating the reader and you'd be putting too much on them. So it helped me figure out balance. So color coding was really useful there. And then that also helped me figure out sections because you could kind of figure out like these little mini arcs in across certain poems, and some of them just felt like natural stopping points. But, they didn't feel like the last poem in the book. They felt like the last poem of a particular thought. And that helped me figure out like, oh, okay, this kind of wants to be its own section. And then these 10 poems kind of want to be their own section. And this one wants to stand on its own as a poem. And yeah, I feel like getting really physical with it really helped me. And I also really like talking about sticky notes and color coding. So I have a
That's
lot to say.
amazing. I love that so much because you're basically, so I use Notion and Scrivener to do all that, and it's fascinating to me that you do that all manually.
Oh, cool. So with Scrivener and Notion for both, can you just like move pages around?
With Scrivener, you can like drag files, but I use
Mhm.
Notion to like assess every poem and see like what it's about. And then I can like use like a spreadsheet type thing to like edit and decide like whether I need more poems that address like a certain subject or a theme or has like certain characters in it. I mostly use it to like edit novels, but yeah, I
Very
find that all
cool.
very fascinating too. I would love to pick your brain sometime.
Oh my God, yeah, we need to talk about this separately because I want to know about your spreadsheets. I'm so
So you brought up birds, and I did have a question about that. There are a lot of birds throughout, and even bird-like apparitions. And I'd love to hear more about the impact birds have had on your life and writing.
I think that birds are so curious to me as winged creatures because as a kid, I really did think that angels were like these benevolent figures that had massive wings. And I think in Islam too, we say that like angels are so big that like one feather from their wing or something is like the size of the universe, something like that. I think I'm misquoting it, but there's something about just like how terribly huge angels are. Um, but yeah, so wings have always been really fascinating to me and compelling. And so birds, even when I was little, for a while when I was like, I think 5 or 6, I thought that birds were angels and like that's what an angel was. And so they've always been very mysterious and like wondrous. Um, and for the past couple of years, I don't know, I just see dead birds all the time. Like that's very much a fact of my life. Everywhere I go, there's just like a dead bird on the ground. And never even dead in like a really gruesome way, but just it's like they just fall out of the sky and are just lying there sleeping, which is so eerie and so jarring every single time, but also really beautiful because it's the only time ever been able to like crouch down and look at a bird up close without, I'm not touching it and trying to like get some sort of bird disease, but I can actually look at the feathers and see the colors and like see the details on its beak, which is really cool, but also kind of morbid. Um, and my partner really loves birds. And I think being with my husband has also made me a lot more attuned to the things that he pays attention to in the world because I'm paying attention to him. And so seeing birds with a partner who loves birds is also really fascinating. And it just sort of naturally bled into my work, where I think birds are like this really great symbol in the world where they feel like omens. And there's a poem, February Augury, about um, a dead bird. And then augury, it's also like I think in the time of the Romans, they would use birds to tell the future, which was really interesting. And I think that concept is really cool. And so, yeah, birds were just the perfect conduit for exploring so many different things like love and desire, and then also the presence of death and just omens and presence and it's a book that's really obsessed with signs and wanting to find signs that God is there and God is speaking to us. And sometimes birds in my life have felt like the closest that I have to a sign, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that is so beautiful. Can you talk a bit about mirrors? They don't come up often in the book, but when they do, every time it's very fascinating to me.
Mirrors, I feel like, are such a I'm kind of scared of mirrors. I can't lie. Yeah. I don't think I've ever said that like out loud, but now that I'm being asked about it, like I do think I'm kind of scared of mirrors. Like at night, like I cannot, if I'm getting up to go to the bathroom or get some water, I like make a point to not look at the mirror when I'm going past. Which might be because of like a horror movie that I saw where there were like people in the mirrors and they came out. But that's besides the point. I think that mirrors for me feel like the closest you get to actually seeing, okay, that sounds really silly, like seeing yourself, but like, we can't see ourselves and we see ourselves in mirrors. But I mean, more like confronting ourselves, where, like, for me, if I want to consider myself in a poem and what it means to come face to face with your sense of self, like the mirror is the perfect way to do that, where you're like regarding yourself in a way intentionally, um, analytically. And I also think that because I spend so much of the book thinking about not just me, Sarah, but the figure, the matriarch, Sarah, it's almost like I'm not trying to say that I'm a doppelganger or anything like that, but there's some sort of refracted thing there that I'm trying to tease out and explore, where if I hold the same name, like, do I share anything else? Do all women named Sarah share anything? Do all women named anything share a quality? I think that's really interesting. And so mirrors feel like a place to sort of symbolize like searching for some sort of connection or resonance or point of, I guess, identification with another, who isn't you, but is some version of a version of you because you have the same name. Um, yeah.
You have the phrase parable and name pretty early on in the book, and I'm so curious to hear you speak about that and tell me like what that means exactly. What does it mean to parable and name?
Mm, I really appreciate that question. I think for me, there's so many things about my personal history that I don't have access to and that I can't know. And the same goes for many elements of my faith and the history of my faith, um, where like my family was heavily influenced by the partition of India and Pakistan. And I also come from a divided background Islamically, where one side of my family is Sunni and the other side of my family is Shia, so two different sects of Islam. And so I feel like there's so much held in my name and in my family names that I can't ever know about completely because some things were lost because of partition, and there are some things that people in my family won't talk about or aren't comfortable talking about because of partition and all of its kind of ongoing trauma and wounds. And so I feel like there's so much that I have to fill in for myself. And I have always been really interested in the fairy tale as a mode or the parable as a mode. And so much of religious knowledge, too, when it's first handed to you as a child, comes through in these sort of, like fabulistic and like moral stories, where it's like a really simplified story trying to teach you a moral in some way. And it's like connected to a religious figure. And I find that mode really, really fun and also really curious, I suppose. I wonder, like, why we find that to work so well. And so I feel like the best thing that I can do as a writer with what I've been given, which is my name and my background and my identity, is if I can't fill in all the gaps of the past, I can try to kind of create a speculative fable or parable of some sort of future. And for me, as a writer, that's looked like kind of taking my name and creating different versions of the world through it, if that makes sense. And for me, that's what parabling my name looks like, where I'm sort of taking the name Sarah and creating a sort of archetypal woman out of that and thinking about who she might be and what her emotions might be and what right and wrong might look like for her. And from there, if I'm thinking about matrilineage in the sense of the women that I come from, what might the future look like, as now I have a daughter and as, the future just moves forward, what kind of ancestor will I be and what comes next? And so, yeah, I feel like the parable is a way to kind of look and speak in both directions in time, where I can think about what came before and also imagine what might come after.
That is so fascinating. And I didn't plan this, of course, because I had no idea how you would respond. But I did have the question, can you expound a bit on the epigraph before that? And now I'm so curious to hear you expound on the epigraph because of
Oh
your
yeah,
response to the
totally.
next question. So
I love the epigraph so much. So Edmund Javis is a Egyptian Jewish writer who I believe ended up in France, and I think he like died in Paris in the 90s. And it's from the Book of Questions by him. And that book, I came across it in grad school, and it's just like this very aphoristic, like out of body reading experience. If you read Etel Adnan, it kind of feels like reading Etel Adnan, but like on an entirely different level, where there isn't like a narrative per se. It's like a book about interrogating like man's place in the world, and then also the concept of the book and the concept of the word. And I know it's very Jewish because like that mode of interrogation is from what I've heard from Jewish friends, like very central to how they relate to their own scripture. Like you can ask a lot of questions, and the book kind of enacts that in a really beautiful way. And I very early on in the book came across that line, I gave you my name, Sarah, and it is a dead end road. And I was just like, whoa, that's like, that has to be the epigraph. Because I think the book is saying the complete opposite. I don't think of the name as a dead end road, but it almost feels like the book then is taking that as a challenge and just refuting it over and over again, or trying to like tunnel out of the dead end road that is presented. Um, yeah, I think it became a really generative sort of epigraph that I could keep on returning to when I felt stuck. And then it would like inspire me all over again to try to write my way out of that possible ending, in the future. What would it mean to just constantly resist your identity or what you've been given as punishment or as a dead end road or as the end of the line or the end of the future? And I think it just reminds me as a writer that despair just isn't an option. And it reminds me not to seek resolution in a way and to try to resist resolution and to push in my work for just conclusions instead. Like I can try to come to a conclusion about an idea or a thought, or even just simply conclude a poem or conclude a book without that meaning that a subject has been completely exhausted, or without that meaning that I'm done and everything has been said and there's nothing else to say. And this is the end, because I very much think that time in the book goes in every direction, and so there is no end. There's just how many different ways can I, like, if it's a crystal, like how many different facets of a subject can I explore without, well, until I feel satisfied.
It is definitely a perfect epigraph. So beautiful. And it's like a mic drop moment right at the beginning. So
His work is so cool. I highly recommend if you haven't read him. It's like just wild.
do you have a favorite poem in the book?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I feel like I don't know if I've ever thought that I have a favorite per se, but I think that I really like, okay, I'll answer it in a couple different ways. I really like reading Matrilineage Recovered, and I'm really proud of it because it took a lot of work to just kind of arrange the poem in a family tree. Um, so that's one that I feel really good about. And I also I really like the poem Fatal Music. It feels like an anthem poem in the book, and it was also the very last poem that I added in, I want to say, late 2022. And it was one that I felt really uncertain about because it just kind of came out of nowhere when I thought the book was done. And then like frantically emailing my press, being like, wait, I think there's one more and I think this has to go. Can someone look at it? Can we talk about it? And everyone agreed that it absolutely belonged in the book. And yeah, I think that one feels really close to me because in the timeline of the book, it was what came all the way at the end. So it feels the newest to me.
It's a great poem. I'm glad it's in there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
What are your favorite poetic forms?
I I really like pantoums. I think they're so much fun and almost impossible. I think they're so hard, but I like that they are just kind of cycling through a thought in a really particular way and that they're so repetitive. I think I'm very, fixated on time and then fixated on saying the same thing over and over again. And the pantoum is the perfect place to do that because you get to keep returning to the previous stanza and dragging it down and then returning again and dragging it down. So it's like you're going back and then forward and back and forward. So I think they're really fun and really great places to sort of like get microscopic about something and then also get to zoom out and think about something else, but then return to the microscopic thing over and over again. And I also, I can't say ghazals are my favorite because I just feel like they're so personal to me that I don't even know how to classify them. They're like literally in my name. So I have like a very difficult relationship with the ghazal because I don't think I've ever written a good one, and I don't know if I ever will, where I just feel like ghazal should not be in English, but yet that's the only way I can write them, and I'm always unhappy with them. But then even when I hear from people about the book, they're always talking about the ghazals. Everyone starts with how much they like them. And I always cringe a little because I'm like, I don't like them, and I wish they weren't in here sometimes. So ghazals, I'm like, I admire them so much, and I feel like I can never, it's like this ideal that I'll never reach, but I do really love ghazals, especially Urdu ghazals set to music. Those feel really special to me. So yeah, I'd say pantoums and ghazals, and I also really I love like a good concrete poem or visual poem that's doing something super weird on the page. Um, I like when they kind of force me to like either turn the book a certain way or like lean closer and regard it differently or start reading again from somewhere else. I think those kind of activate my brain in a new way.
Can you give our viewers a prompt based on Theophanies?
Sure. I kind of want to give people the prompt that I was given that started off the book, which would be to write a poem or a sequence of poems exploring the origins of your name. And I would say not just one like element of your name, every element of your name. So if you have a middle name, like write one exploring that, one for your last name, one for your first. If you want to bring in like your mother's maiden name or your own maiden name, that could be really interesting. Yeah, just whatever you can dig up about your name if you could explore its origins. I think that could be interesting.
So you were talking about ghazals and Urdu. Do you ever write in Urdu?
I wish. I really, really do wish. I feel like so I my first language is Urdu and I am pretty fluent conversationally. Like it's the language of my home, it's how I talk to my parents. But like conversational Urdu is not poetic Urdu in the slightest. Like that's something entirely different on this whole other level. And I have tried to read Urdu poetry so many times, but it's incredibly hard because that formal level of Urdu pulls a lot from Farsi and also has some Arabic thrown in too. And if like I don't know Farsi like that, I know a couple words here and there, and then same with Arabic. Like it's the language that I read the Quran in, but it's not one that I speak or have any mastery over. So I feel like you need knowledge of like a whole other language, and then also that language's set of idioms and particular context, you know, like sometimes there will be jokes and I have absolutely no idea what the joke is because I don't really get humor in Urdu either. Like, you know, it's the language that you speak in your household is so different from the context of living in a country where everyone is speaking that language and you have like a shared context and shared like vernacular that way. So I feel like I'm still too scared to really seriously try to write poems in Urdu because I just feel like I won't be able to resist trying to measure them against like the great Urdu poems and the great Urdu poets. I've tried here and there to like write a line and see if I can go from there, but then I get embarrassed really fast and just stop. I'm like self-censoring, you know, I don't have to show it to anyone, but I can't even do it. But that's like a lofty goal I have to one day have some sort of proficiency in a more poetic Urdu. And I think I'm gonna need to take a class or like really sit down with my dad and practice to actually get there.
My husband is actually a translator from Spanish to English,
Mm.
and he tried to get me into like translating by getting started on like Urdu poetry, and it's a completely different language.
It's like I if you don't know, I feel like for me, can you read Urdu at all?
A little bit, but not well.
It's like the words that I can read well in Urdu, it's words that I already recognize, so I can like predict what it's going to be, you know? But if you come across a word that you don't know and have never read, it's hard to read it like to begin with. Like I feel like even reading Urdu, you need so much context to do it because it doesn't have like the Arabic vowel markers, you know?
Yeah,
So I'm
absolutely.
just like, I just get stuck and then I get overwhelmed. It's so hard. I feel like Urdu is really hard.
I want to
Fun.
make sure that I get some audience questions in, especially this one. How has writing slash reading helped you in difficult times?
Hmm. I think so. Is this specifically about poetry or just reading and writing in general?
I think they just mean reading and writing in general. And I think
Okay.
they're talking about the current social and political events that we're facing
Hmm.
right now.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, I think that this, like, my answer varies depending on genre here, where I feel like poetry is such a distilled form where sometimes, you know, it's hard for me to read a poetry collection that's particularly heavy, start to finish in one sitting, because each poem carries so much in it that you have to step into and fully embody in a way that it can really overwhelm me and sometimes like hurt even more. And so sometimes in times of crisis or times where the world is in crisis, I am looking for individual poems, that can kind of capture some of that despair and sort of reveal a facet of hope that might also be there that maybe we aren't recognizing. But I don't think for me personally that a lot of poetry, like a collection, is what I would turn to hold all of that because it ends up wounding me even more. Like it's just I can't sit in someone else's interiority like that for too long because it's just too painful. So for times where I really need to see like a glimmer of hope or be reminded that the future is still, sort of open and unwritten and we're still trying to make it. I turn to fiction there. I think that I like a longer, more sustained narrative feels like a healthy place for me to kind of lose myself, so to speak, in another version that already has like a fixed ending, that will reveal something to me. So it feels like a more comfortable, safe space to process a particular issue. Um, I think that that makes sense, where like it just like an individual poem can hold so much, but then like 20 poems in a row can really hurt. But then one sustained story that you can take your time with feels like a more slowed down place to kind of rest your brain for a little bit. But I think that depending on the moment, reading at all, whether it's poetry or fiction, is what like reminds me that I have a body. And I think poetry does that better for me. Poetry does that more directly, where I remember that I'm a human being and flesh and I have blood and I'm in relation to other people, and that those relationships are really, they can be contentious, but then they're also the most meaningful thing that we have. And it's like my body is all I have to communicate with your body. And so even when it hurts and even when a poem can just like sink to the bottom of your stomach and you recognize like a horrible truth or a beautiful truth in that poem, even when it hurts, it's still the most visceral reminder that I am in a body and I am alive. And so I think that that is what ends up being really good for me and good for my soul and good for my brain. And also then more fruitful for my writing, where, yeah, if a poem that I write can remind someone else that they're alive and that they can do things with their body, then I think that I've accomplished something. So maybe just remembering that or reframing what the work does in the world can help in difficult times.
That's beautiful. And last question, how did you come up with the idea for the title of the book?
Okay, so this is actually a really difficult thing for me to answer. A few people have asked me, and I actually can't remember the moment that I came across this word. I've gone through my journal from grad school, and there's a page where I wrote in really big letters, Theophanies, circled it a bunch of times, and then wrote the definition under it, but I didn't date the page. And like there's no other information, like there's no other context that can help me figure out like where I found it. So I don't know if I was reading another book and saw the word there, or just like came across the word online somewhere, or what, because I only have the record of me finding the definition, but not in what context. So it's like I remember the feeling of like writing that down and thinking like this would be a really great title. I think that this like captures what I've been interested in and what I've been trying to do in my work without like forcing my work to go in a particular direction either. Like it's still really open-ended, but I can't remember where I found the word and I wish that I did. But yeah, I feel like as soon as I wrote that down, I knew like this is what I want to be my title because it felt so open-ended and so vast as a concept that it feels like the kind of word that I could write like a million poems under. Like there could be a million Theophanies poems and I just would never be done. And even with the book as a whole, like I still don't feel like it's complete or that it'll ever be complete. I don't know if anyone feels like that, but like if I wasn't forced to finally stop revising it or finally stop like adding poems in or taking poems out, I feel like I could keep writing into this project forever, which I think might also be contributing to some of my writer's block. But yeah,
It sounds like you have another collection in you.
I hope. I hope so.
All right, Sarah,
Stella.
thank you so much. This was so incredible, and I can't wait to share it.
This was amazing. This was so fun. I feel like I just rambled at you for an hour.
I
Thanks.
loved it. It was amazing, and I can't wait to learn more about your work and about you. Where can people find you online?
So my website is sarahgali.com. So sarahgali.com. And then I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram. And if you type my full name, I should come up. So Sarah Ghazal Ali. It's always weird to like pronounce a username out loud, but it's say Sarah. So it's like at CAESARAH on both of Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, that's where I live on the internet.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you for doing this. Like, thanks for taking the
Absolutely.
time. This was so much fun. Thanks for reading my book. It means everything to me.